morning, everybody. This is yet another of the series of long interviews with Ananda Europe pioneers. We are here in Moksha Kutir, the house that where Swami Kriyananda would live when he was in Europe and where he also left his body. And I'm very happy to be here with Naya Swami Lakshman, who did not live for long periods in Ananda Europe, but he was Swami Kriyananda's secretary and had therefore a very special position. He followed Swamiji everywhere during his travels all over the world, visiting the various Ananda communities. So, Lakshman, thank you for being here with us. Wonderful. And my first question is, as usual, how did you get in touch? How did you find this path? How did you find Yogananda? This is always a very important moment, usually a turning point in people's lives. And how did it happen with you?
Yeah, those are always interesting stories. We so easily imagine that we're the ones who are in charge of our lives. And I think probably in everybody's story, the theme is that something wonderful happened because someone else was in charge of their lives. And that was true for me too. I had been a perennial student. I hadn't lived outside of schools since I was a baby, I suppose. And I'd finally reached a point. I was serious about my studies. I wanted to understand the truth. I wasn't self-consciously seeking spiritually, but I wanted to know the truth. I felt that that's what would tell me how to lead a good life, the life that I wanted, and a happy life. And I'd gotten to the point in my studies where I'd really seen in a deep way that those professors didn't have the answers. And so I was just getting ready to enter another degree program, yet another degree program, just because I didn't know what else to do. And at that point, a friend of mine, actually, that I had known since boyhood, wrote to me. He had discovered Ananda. And he wrote in such glowing terms. I'd never seen him so enthusiastic about anything. And he encouraged me to come visit him over Christmas, and I did that. And then I came back the following Christmas. And I was immediately very strongly drawn to this path. But it was so different from everything that I'd ever done that I couldn't quite just turn my life upside down. But something in me, I said, you've experienced something wonderful here. So if you're not ready to do it, go back to your nice job and your nice home, on the other side of the country, and see whether that works for you. But don't make the rest of your life a failed experiment showing that you should have come back to Ananda, but that you didn't. And I didn't understand that at the time, but that was a good prayer. And Master really answered that prayer. And in the next months, he made it very clear to me that it was not my place where I'd got, with that nice job and that nice house. And that would be a long story to get into, but the upshot was at the end, I realized that was not my family, it wasn't my home. I'd always been drawn to community, and so I had been drawn to an academic community, but I learned how shallow that really was compared to what I wanted. So I came back to Ananda and had a wonderful time, and after 6 months, suddenly I thought, no, wait a second. Just how had I decided to move here? When did I make that decision? When did I decide to throw away all those expensive years of education that I had had? It was a moment of a little bit of doubt. But Master again had been very gracious to me, because if those doubts had come earlier, maybe I wouldn't have had the experience to answer them. But here it was, after 6 months at the village, he lifted the veil. So a little doubt got in, but by that point I had an experience and I knew where my home was.
So Lakshman, so this looks like that your first experience was actually traveling to Ananda, visiting the place. Can you remember the first impact when you arrived there at Ananda village for the first time?
It was very heart-opening. I have to say that people with whom I had studied also had heart. They were people with passion who wanted to understand. But they, and I suppose I would have to say I as well, We were very much in our minds also. That's how we were operating with the world. And people at Ananda village came so much from their heart. And that touched me very much. I remember going to a kirtan and thinking this was very peculiar. But I really loved it. My friend brought me there. I was embarrassed to admit how much I'd liked it because it seemed so strange. I kept hoping that he would take me to another kirtan without my having to ask, and he didn't. But I got my chance in future years. I was very, very much moved by the music, and this is a very common story at Ananda. In fact, Swami Kriyananda has said, if you want to get to know me, listen to my music. And I came at Christmas time, and so a lot of what I was hearing was Christmas music. And I heard the most beautiful Christmas carols I'd ever heard. I thought, how is it that I never heard this music before? I didn't realize that Swami Kriyananda had written this music. I thought it must just be in the popular canon. And I think that had a lot to do, really, with my decision to move there.
And what year are we in?
What year are we in?
More or less.
This was the Christmas of 1983.
Okay. So you are, it's I think, significant that you speak about the music and about the heart first, because I know that you are also a very ardent reader. So when did the books come into your life, like Autobiography of a Yogi, The Path, The New Path? How did that, in the timeline, the chronology, when did that happen?
Well, I did not read the Autobiography of a Yogi until after I came to Ananda. I had read at least part of The Path before coming to Ananda. I'm not aware that they were very important in getting me there, although they were certainly helpful. The books became very important to me after I was at Ananda. Certainly those two books became important. But after I'd been there a little while, Swamiji, Swami Kriyananda, put out a call to the community. Excuse me. He said, I'm writing more books now, and is there anyone in the community who might like to volunteer to proofread my books? And I thought, this would be interesting, so I volunteered. And before very long, the people who were, because I didn't have direct contact with Swamiji, people would bring me his manuscripts. I would, mark them up and give them back. But after a while, they told me, Swamiji, really, we don't know what you're doing, but he really likes what you're doing. And before very long at all, I was the only one who was doing the proofreading for him. And only years later did it occur to me that probably when Swami put out that call, he knew that it was for me. And he often didn't tip his hat and things like that. But I saw over the years that every new person who came to the community, Swamiji, you didn't think that he even knew who you were, but he tuned into you and he was really wondering, how can I pull this person in? How can I help him? And he quickly learned that that would be a very good way to help me. Because I'd been a student for all these years, my first inclination was to have nothing further to do with books. But that would have been going way too far in the other direction, and Swami kept me on target.
Okay, and so can you remember the first time you had a private meeting with Swami?
The early connections I had with him, I couldn't really glorify with the term meeting. They were just quick connections. One of them, I was proofreading. He wrote what he called at the time rules for conduct, a rule for conduct for Ananda members. It's since been renamed guidelines for conduct. And that was one of the rare instances where I'd marked up the manuscript and I got to hand it to him in person. And afterwards, he said, he did more work on it and he sent it back to me. And I noticed a section there in which he said that if one should not pay overly much attention to one's dress, but one should dress neatly and appropriately because other people have to have to look at you. And in particular, one shouldn't wear clothes that are torn or tattered if better clothing is available. And I thought, I don't remember reading that section when I handed the thing over to him before. And it made me wonder, just how was I dressed when I handed that to him? So I don't know, but perhaps I'm responsible for that little section in in that book. Another connection I had with Swamiji was, this was maybe of more substance. It was at a Christmas. I don't remember now just which year it was. I'd been there just about 2 years. Ananda was growing in those days. It used to be that Swami would invite the whole community over for Christmas in the dome in his home. But by the time I arrived, not everybody could fit. So the newer members weren't invited. After you were there for a couple of years, by then there was room for you. And so this was my first time that I was getting to attend this. So I was very, very pleased to be able to do this. And I arrived right on time. I was new and I didn't understand that everybody else arrives early. So I arrived, the place is packed. And Swamiji, he has sort of a long dining room, and I come in at one end of the dining room and he's at the other. And he spies me across a crowd of, talking people. And my name at the time was Alan. And he said, "Alan, I have terrible news." So now everyone is silent. You could hear a pin drop. And he says, "But first, Happy Christmas." And he then explains that a book that I had proofread, an entire paragraph had gotten left out of that book and had been published that way. It was just missing a paragraph. And of course, I felt terrible about this. I won't go into the whole story. In a sense, I had not made a mistake. It was something I hadn't noticed, but the way that one does these things, one wouldn't be expected to notice. And Swamiji said, "Well, we just can't have that. You just have to reread the book at every stage to make sure that doesn't happen." And I knew that that wasn't possible. So this was actually an introduction in how to work with Swamiji, because I couldn't do literally what he had asked me to do, but I could think of a way to meet his request in a different way. And so I came up with a system that, in fact, we use to this day in proofreading his books, that involves in part using the computer to help us compare early versus late versions of the book. And and then a little bit later, I was trying to make amends for this mistake. And so I thought, well, why don't I print up that missing paragraph? So I printed up 150 copies just on little pieces of paper. I cut them out and I put one in everybody's mailbox with a little note saying, "This poor paragraph has lost its way. Won't you please return it to its home, at the bottom of page 73.
Which book are we talking about?
It was called Affirmations and Prayers at the time. Swamiji since renamed it Affirmations for Self-Healing. And so I came to Swamiji's box and I hesitated and I thought, oh, why not? I put one in his box. And that's the only thing he'd ever seen me write before he asked me to become his secretary. So I've always wondered whether, it's a little fanciful. I don't know that it made a difference. But anyway, those were two early stories.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I want to, not for too long, we'll just go back a little bit and ask you about this question. When you left everything, basically, you left your job, you left your studies, those expensive years of studying that you mentioned, did you need to summon up some courage to do all that? This is for young people, often a dilemma, and how did your family react to it?
I didn't need to summon up any courage at all. It simply held no interest for me anymore. And Ananda held a lot of interest. What would have required some kind of force of will would have been to try and stick to it. My brother at the time said, you should finish your thesis at least before going to Ananda. You're not following through on what you should have. And superficially, that might have seemed to be a virtuous thing to do, but it would have taken a push to do something like that. And I'm sorry, you asked the second question. What was it?
How did your family react?
Yes, my family was, it was very difficult for my family. My brother less so, because he had some spiritual openings in his life. My parents were very good parents. All they wanted was that I be happy, but they didn't understand this at all. And so it was hard for them to feel any certainty that this would bring me happiness. So I would call home, and every week. And for the first year, my mother cried every single phone call. And, but after a while, after a year, maybe more, she especially could see that I was happy. And she said, I don't understand what you're doing, but I see that it makes you happy and you have my blessings, which was a lot for her to say. My father also, he was a small businessman. He would have loved to bring me into the business. That's how those things work. Instead, he ended up getting no money at all for what would have been a profitable ongoing business. All he wanted was my happiness. He never pressured me to do it. And so similarly for him. So I was very blessed that way. And I'm happy to be able to say that I feel my parents were very blessed for the parents that they had been, and for the fact that although they hadn't quite understood it, they had given a child to God. And Yogananda teaches us that family members, to varying degrees, 7 generations forward and back, are blessed when a child comes to God. And I saw in their later years how true that was. My relationship to them actually became much closer, and they were very blessed, particularly in their last years.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So at a certain point, Swami asked you to become his secretary. How did that come about?
I really don't know. He just asked me. It was.
When was it?
This was in 1990. I suppose the summer or early fall of 1990. He'd already had me on his staff to create a video department, at which I was utterly incompetent, and I'm sure he saw that pretty quickly. So I think he was looking for something else to give me to do. Very kind of him, instead of just giving up on me. So I got an inkling earlier in the day that he was going to ask me to do something else. Someone came up to me and said, congratulations. And when he saw that I didn't know what he was talking about, he just said, oh, nothing. And he just sort of slunk away. And then I was very nervous because he had a secretary. The only thing that I could see open on his staff was to be a gardener, and which would have been a wonderful blessing to be his gardener, but I just didn't think I could do it. My energy doesn't naturally flow that way. And I just couldn't imagine that I could bring my energy up in the way that would have been necessary. So when he told me himself that he asked me if I would be a secretary, I was a little nervous, of course, but also very grateful that I wasn't at least going to have to be the gardener.
What were your main secretarial tasks?
Yeah, well, that was interesting. After I'd been his secretary for a few months, I opened some drawer that I hadn't opened before, and it contained a lot of back and forth correspondence between Swamiji and his previous secretary. And I was very interested to find that the kind of work that he'd asked her to do was completely different from what he was having, or largely different. And so Swamiji, Swamiji, there are several fundamental precepts guiding his communities. And one of them is that people are more important than things. You might think for someone as important as Swami Kriyananda, he'd been given a very important work. He would need to find someone who would serve him most effectively. But no, he would never use anybody. So he got a sense of what would be good for me to do, which in some instances it meant what I was good at, but not necessarily. Sometimes he would give you challenges if those were good for you. And So the work that I did, certainly writing, drafting many letters, people would write to him from all over the world. And it was remarkable to see that people who'd never met him before, you could tell in the way they wrote the letter, they already knew that he was their friend. His consciousness was somehow that clear and strong that he could project it, and people who hadn't met him would feel it. So that was a big part. He also was doing a lot of writing, and I was doing the proofreading. And sometimes he would go over a book 50 times, and then I would be rereading the book 50 times. So I think he thought that I needed, I was maybe a bit of a slow learner, and I needed all the opportunity I could to absorb these things. I also worked a lot with the publishing company in bringing those books to publication. Excuse me. Also, he had me in the early days write indexes to a number of his books. And this was very challenging for me, and he knew it. In fact, at one point he asked me, he was always very understated and gently. He said, "So Alan, what do you think? Do you think we could use an index for this book?" And the more I pondered it, the more I couldn't really quite deal with this idea. And a week later, I hadn't said anything to him. So he said, "Oh, about that index." And I said, "Oh, I'm not so sure the book needs an index." But then at that point, Swamiji said, "Write the index." I kind of had to chain myself to a desk to do it, but it was very good for me. And then another thing that I did, it was a lot of my work actually was computer support for him, because he was using computers all the time. And they were very important to his work, to his writing, for one, and also for his music composing. I was one. He asked me to choose a program for him to use, and it was these programs were more. He did not want to become an expert in these programs, and so he could often get himself into trouble. And it's not that he didn't have the intelligence; he could have mastered anything like that very easily, but there felt, I think, something, and there was a lesson for it, and a lesson for us in it, that he did not want to have to adjust his consciousness to tune into the consciousness of the program. He felt that the program should tune into his consciousness. And I think in everything that we did in our lives, he wanted us to come from our center, and from there to give to the world, rather than to try to figure out what the world was asking of us and somehow or others try and adapt outwardly to what it was doing. So Swamiji would sometimes get himself into fixes at the computer. So there were a lot of, I enjoyed that very much. I went to great lengths to make sure that he wouldn't lose his work and that it was as convenient as possible for him.
Yeah, you helped me a lot, because I lost all the emails that he sent to me, and you kindly looked them up and you found them and you sent them to me. So that was I guess that is very important also for other people.
Yes, of course, there wasn't very much you threw away. You had a sense that a lot of these things, often I'm needing to go back to figure out just what did Swamiji say about this. So I have 30 or 40 years worth of emails, and I'm glad that I kept them.
Yeah, wonderful. At a certain point, I remember that it became known that he had given you a spiritual name, Lakshman. How did he motivate that?
Well, Swamiji would never foist such things on people, but if people asked, there was a time when he didn't have enough bandwidth really to do that. But it was just before and after that, he was available for that. And so I did ask him for a spiritual name. This would have been, I think, in 2003. And he didn't answer me for 8 months, which was unusual for him. And then he finally gave me this name. And I realized there had been an earlier member of the community to whom Swamiji had given this name. And he had left the community. But Swamiji didn't know whether perhaps he would come back. And he wouldn't have wanted to give me this name if that person might come back. So I think he waited a long time until he felt inwardly that just wasn't happening. So I thought that was very kind of him. And as for the meaning of the name, I asked him, sometimes names have particular meanings in Sanskrit. He said no, he wasn't aware that it did, nor was he aware that it had any relationship etymologically to the name Lakshmi. What he had in mind was the character Lakshman, in the
From the
Indian
Ramayana.
epic. That's right, which I hadn't read, but I read it very quickly after that. And I've always interpreted it as, Lakshman had a number of outstanding virtues, but one of them was loyalty to the king, to his brother Rama. And this was my sense of what it was. And it was, I was very grateful for the name because loyalty on the one hand is something that's very deep in me, certainly to Swamiji, but in general. To master, to the spiritual path, to whatever I did in previous lifetimes to have the good karma, to have been given this one. And, but also a quality in which I have a great deal to develop. So I was grateful for both of those aspects of it.
I remember that he actually wrote, and I don't know why I remember it, but I do remember that you had always been a very good friend, simply, and that Lakshman also indicates that friendship.
This is the first I hear that.
Yeah.
That's nice to hear.
Yeah. So not only you have described your secretarial work, but you also were part of Swami's staff, traveling all over the world with him. So before we go to Ananda, India, I would like to ask you, do you remember any particular experiences or things that Swami shared in how he related to the work here in Europe, how he wanted to build it, how he supported it, the people here?
It's not something of which he spoke to me, but Swamiji was ever new. He didn't. If he'd given a talk on a particular topic 100 times, the 101st would be a different talk, and he wouldn't go back and look at the notes, and so. He was quite different when he came to Ananda Assisi because the needs here were different. For just one example, in many talks, I remember him emphasizing that, yes, we can make mistakes. We have to pay for our mistakes, but God is a God of love and nothing is forever. The concept of eternal damnation is simply, it's a projection because when we're caught in something, it may feel to us that it's going to last forever. But of course it doesn't. Yogananda taught us we have a divine destiny, every one of us. But that was an emphasis that he gave here that I didn't see him give in other places because of the teachings of the Catholic Church, which many of the people here grew up with. His talks came more from the heart, and it's not that he was more in his heart. He was always in his heart, and also, very much, he had very interesting ideas. But that was the level on which it was most natural to meet people here. And he also, connected to that, I suppose, is that at Ananda Village, he was involved in the running of the community. He had already delegated a lot of responsibility to Jyotish and Devi, Durga and Vidura and others. But still, he was, the buck stopped with him, and they, when things were difficult, they would come to him with questions. And even when they didn't, trying to spare that, he knew, he understood. And, he was, the role that he had chosen in this lifetime was as our friend. And so he was their friend. So of course he was going to help them. But it did put him in that particular role. When he came here, he was very happy to be able to drop that. And everyone in the community, including the community leaders, all of them were very respectful of that. And so Swamiji, he was always busy, but he could relax away from that role at least, in a way that brought out a different side of him that everybody enjoyed. And often he got to focus more on his writing or on his composing while he was here.
So you remember that he actually did a lot of writing here in this house?
Oh, yes. Yeah, quite a bit. And, I don't know whether the camera is showing this chair or whether it can, but I would come over each day, or maybe not every single day.
Often.
to bring Swamiji the mail, and he would be sitting in this chair, and I would be kneeling right here, and often he would have manuscripts that were all marked up, things that he'd done. He would invite people over for tea, and he would share the latest version of the manuscript. That also wherever he was, in India and America as well. One very important book that he wrote here, towards the end, it was a renunciate order for the New Age. That's where my title of Naya Swami comes from. And but many other books as well.
Can you remember anything specific about the genesis of that book that you mentioned?
Yes, it was a remarkable book. Swamiji had been very ill. And now wait, am I right that he wrote that here, or was it in India?
I think
no, it was here. It was here. No, in fact, this couch played a little role in it. He had been very ill, and he really had the feeling that it might be time for him to leave his body. And he was open to do that, and he prayed to Yogananda, I would be very happy to leave. This has been a hard life, and you've promised me wonderful things when I leave this body. If you want me to go, I'm very happy to go. But I live to serve you, and this plane, for all of its deficiencies, if that's where you want me, that's where I want to be. That's heaven. And from that point, Swamiji recovered. He had an absolutely miraculous recovery. I've never seen anything like it. He looked 20 years younger. I remember thinking, he looks 55, or maybe I was thinking 60. And before I said it to anyone else, someone else said to me, he looks 50. I thought that might be an exaggeration. He just felt like a much younger man again. And when he began to recover from that illness, he said to Asha, it was, now I understand why I was suffering so much in my body, what it was that Satan was trying to prevent. And it was the creation of this new renunciate order. And right now, it's not a huge thing. There are a number of members, in this order, but primarily in the Ananda communities. But Swamiji didn't write it for the Ananda communities. He wrote it for the world. This order as a successor to the Swami order that is it 2,000 years old, however old it is, in India. We're in a new age now, this age of energy, and these teachings need to be presented in a different way. And this new order that Swamiji brought forth has a couple of key points to it. One is that it's open to a much broader array of people, and in particular to married people. There can be married swamis. They need to, of course, make vows of renunciation, but they can do this as couples. And the other, and maybe more fundamental difference, is that in the past, renunciation was defined in terms of all the things you were not supposed to do. And there are all kinds of things that it's a good idea not to do. They bring you in the wrong direction. But it's a matter of emphasis, and it's an important difference. In this order, the emphasis is on what we aspire to, and then what we need to do to achieve those things to which we aspire. And for that reason, he also changed the color. Swamis in the traditional order in India wore orange, which symbolizes the fire of renouncing all the things you're not supposed to do. You throw them into a fire to be symbolically burned up. But this color blue is symbolic of the spiritual eye, which is the focus of our aspirations. So it's very interesting. I mean, you might wonder, by whose authority did he create an order like this? Shankaracharya created the current order in India, a long time ago. And Swamiji strongly suspected that Yogananda was Shankaracharya in a previous lifetime. He probably had a lot of reasons for that. One that I remember his mentioning is that Yogananda told some stories from the life of Shankaracharya that Swamiji had not heard or seen anywhere else, and that he couldn't help but think that the only way that Master would have known those things is if he himself had been Shankaracharya. So it's by Master's authority that this new order has come into being, and as I mean, like many other things that Swamiji did in this life, his books, the communities, perhaps most notably, these were commissions from Yogananda. And, Swami Kriyananda would never have done something like this if he didn't feel that it had been given to him by Yogananda. So it's a very, very important development. That's why I'm taking a little bit of time to do it. Anyone who hears this, who feels at all drawn to a life of renunciation and setting aside.
Read the book.
Yeah, read the book. Yeah, exactly. And the book is called The Renunciate Order for the New Age.
I remember you, Lakshman, being among those who were the first who took that vow back in 2008. How did you get into that process of deciding that you wanted to take those vows? Probably very natural. But...
Yes, it was natural to want to get involved in any new initiative that Swami had. He did it for a reason. I was a little hesitant to do it and unsure because, it's not as if I'd been spending my whole life looking for romantic relationships, not at all. But, one has these desires, and neither was I sure that I was prepared to, that I could legitimately just renounce that desire entirely and do this. And so I wasn't entirely sure in what way I would join this order. Swamiji had said that he wasn't going to invite us. We needed to ask. So I went over as a secretary one day and I said, Swamiji, you said we need to ask. I would love to be in this order anywhere that you would have me. But he wasn't going to let me off the hook so easily. He said, well, in what way did you want to do it? Because it's possible to become what's called a tyagi, where you see your life for the time being as one in which you're in a relationship. And so I hadn't anticipated this question, and I just blurted out, not a tyagi, because that wasn't what I wanted. And he laughed, he smiled, and he said, well, I think you're pure enough that you could take the Naya Swami vow. And it was very sweet of him, but by this point I was already somewhat older, and I think he had the feeling for those of us who are not young, that better to make hay while the sun shines, So ordinarily I would first have taken vows of brahmacharya, but for a number of us he said, okay, let's just move right ahead to the Naya Swami vow, and I was grateful.
Thank you. So let's talk a little bit more about Swami's books. In a more private conversation between you and I asked you, what is your main dharma at the moment? And you mentioned something about that.
Yes, well, I worked a lot with Swamiji's books, as I said, during his lifetime. And one time, the two of us were just taking a walk around the block by his house. And out of nowhere, he changed the subject and said, Lakshman, most authors, after their passing, get remembered perhaps for one of their books, no more than that. And then he changed the subject back to whatever it had been. And so I didn't say a thing. He didn't ask me to comment, but he had to know exactly how I was reacting to a comment like that. It was not with your book, Swamiji. He wrote over 150 books, and there was no fluff in there at all. Everyone was important. In fact, as his secretary, when I would be answering a letter, often I thought the two of the most important things I needed to do, one was to encourage people to come visit the Ananda community closest to them, because however much you get from the books, and I'll go into that in a minute, there's something just life-transforming about coming to a village like Ananda village, where I spent most of my time, like Ananda Assisi. It changes lives. These are shrines. But the The other thing I would often want to do in answering the letter, I mean, it wasn't like some rule, but always some book would occur to me. This is a book you might like to read. And I came to see that every book, it was written for different people. Because different people need to to be reached out to in different ways. And Swami didn't want to leave anybody unreached out to. So I'd always had that sense for his books. And these are books for posterity. Nowadays most books get remaindered within a few years. But these books, I'll tell you, sometimes now when I'm reading one of his books, I'll laugh for joy with the feeling, a real feeling, that what I can feel in that moment is that when he wrote the book, it wasn't just in that moment, that he was projecting his consciousness forward into the future. And I really felt that, so it was a real connection between him then and me right now. And so it's, I mentioned earlier, Swamiji said, if you want to get to know me, listen to my music. But the other part of that is to read his books. And we're passing through a time right now where many people, especially young people, don't read as much as people did in the past, which I suppose it probably has some advantages, certainly has its disadvantages. Fortunately, Swamiji recorded audio recordings of most of his books, so they're available that way as well. And I'm finding there's actually a lot to do with him. You wouldn't think, he's been out of the body now for more than 10 years, but there really is. Right now, for example, I'm working in trying to make the books work much better in ebook format, getting them indexed properly, keeping them accurate. In this world, it's just entropy, I suppose. We published the book 5 years ago, we republish it now, and I discover little things that have gone wrong. So I guess that's the answer to you.
Thank you. Let's name 2 or 3 books shortly, and you just give a little immediate comment on it. Now, one is, since you studied philosophy, is Out of the Labyrinth. Is that a book that people would read?
It's a book that I would recommend to very few, actually, and Swamiji said the same. It's a book where he went into the lion's den and tried to rebut the arguments of atheistic writers and philosophers in their own terms. So if you're someone over whom that has a grip, but you're looking to move beyond it, or if for whatever reason you're teaching people like that and you'd like to open up their vistas, that's a wonderful book to read. But otherwise, probably not.
Okay. The essence of the Bhagavad Gita.
The essence of the Bhagavad Gita, Swamiji described as his most important work, I think he felt. And there's a miraculous story of how that even came to be written, because Yogananda had indicated to him that he would edit that work, and yet the Yogananda's original manuscripts weren't available to Swamiji. So for many, many years he prayed, how can I fulfill this commission you've given me? And it was miraculously fulfilled. It was miraculously written. I don't even remember how many pages it was, but he wrote the entire thing in 7 weeks, something that he expected would take many years.
Inconceivable.
Yeah, and then he edited it. Usually his editing would take quite some time, also very, very quick. It was just a flow of divine inspiration.
One more, because it will take us to my final question. A place called Ananda.
A place called Ananda. Now, do you remember the new title?
I forgot. I know there's a new title.
What is it?
Well, maybe it will come if you start talking about it.
Yeah. Well, it may not. I mean, in fact, it has not yet been published under its new title. And the reason he changed the title is that people felt it was. It's not fair to call it a misnomer. I mean, Swami did have a reason to do it, but anyone looking at that title would be likely to get the wrong impression of what that book was about. And the book describes Yogananda spoke with great force during his lifetime about the importance of communities. Swamiji was with him just the last 3.5 years of his life. But during those years, he said, it didn't matter what the published topic of a talk was. Master would start talking about the importance of communities, places where like-minded people could come together. He described those as lives of simple living and high thinking. Because, as he said, environment is stronger than will. The spiritual path is not easy, and anything that you can do to give yourself a leg up is well worth doing. Certainly, if it's possible for you in your life to move to such a community, I would heartily, encourage you to explore the possibility. Many people aren't free to do that. We also have an online community through which you can connect and come visit these communities from time to time.
And meditation groups, of course.
And meditation groups, of course. Yeah. So, with all the fervor with which Yogananda spoke of these things, and by the way, a wonderful book to read, in some sense one might call it a companion book to a place called Ananda, is Swamiji's book, The New Path. And very accessible to everybody. Maybe the most important book for me of his that I've read. I'd encourage that too. Yogananda's organization had just, they were not in tune with that at all. The organization's head, when Swamiji asked her, when are we going to have these communities? She said, frankly, I'm not interested. So it was obviously for Swamiji to develop them. And that was a great part of his life's work. But it only became possible because he ended up being ejected from his guru's organization. A very painful time of his life. And so this book, A Place Called Ananda, starts telling that story. But Swamiji saw it as integrally connected to Ananda, that emerged. The books that he wrote, the communities he founded, none of them would have been possible. So that's why he chose that title. But if you want to know more about what is the Ananda community like, there are other books that also written by community members that address that more. So,
Lakshman, it's been so wonderful it sort of felt like a journey through many years of your friendship with Swami, your service to Ananda, your experiences and so forth. We are now also talking together to younger people who have never known Swami Kriyananda. And is there anything in general that you would advise them, some counsel, some ideas to hold on to? People in their life, whether it's in a meditation group, they want maybe to start a meditation group or help develop it, or maybe even a community. We are here in Europe, things are changing a lot in Germany, in Russia, in England, in the Netherlands, even in France, Spain. So is there anything that you would like to tell them to encourage them?
Yes, a couple of things. It's a good question. Yogananda was the opposite of sectarian. He was not proselytizing. He was not trying to bring people to him personally. And this is true of Ananda and of Swami Kriyananda as well. But the other side of it, and Swamiji has written in this vein, he said, if you have felt drawn to explore the spiritual path through this channel, I mean, you're watching this video, you're not watching a video, done by someone on another path, then I encourage you to explore it seriously, because there are many paths to God, but there's something very special about this path. It's not to denigrate other paths, but some masters have very few disciples. But Yogananda, it doesn't make him a master closer to God than any other master. All masters are equal in God. But the commission that Yogananda was given by God was to create something great in the outward sense, that would, he was Swami Kriyananda described him as the way shower for a new age. And so if you feel drawn in this way, get to know Yogananda, really tune into him, make him your friend. And if you feel drawn to this particular expression, because there are other expressions of Yogananda, such as the organization that he founded. If you feel drawn to this particular one, then make Swami Kriyananda your friend. Get to know him. This is why I mentioned the music, I mentioned the books. The books are about much, much more than information. Do I have time to tell that short story?
Absolutely.
One time someone wrote to Swami Kriyananda, and he was a writer himself, was an Ananda member, and he said, your writing is a little bit complex. Your sentences are a little bit on the long side. You're a good writer. Your sentences are clear, but you make your reader work a little bit. And I think that you might be more effective if you had shorter, punchier sentences. And I give the guy credit. He really had chutzpah. He chose a passage out of Swamiji's writing.
What did he have?
I don't remember which. Oh,
no.
Oh yeah, chutzpah. It's
a Yiddish word.
It's a Yiddish word. It's in the English dictionary now, but maybe I shouldn't. Nerve,
Yeah.
And then he rewrote it in the style that he was suggesting. And Swami read it and smiled, and he said to me, if I can draw people into my vibration when they're reading my book, that's when I can really help them. His books are about much more than the information that's in there. For example, there's a lot of music in his books. Rhythm was very, very important to him. As he edited it, he did it for a rhythm that caused these things just to sink in ways that are hard to describe. Writing that way is its own language. So that would be one encouragement that I would give you to go deep wherever your inspiration is. Although I suspect this may be true more for Swamiji than for many other teachers. This I don't know. But because he left us so much outwardly, also thousands of lectures that are recorded that you can watch. And again, Swami didn't want people transcribing them and editing them, which they would need, because it would change the vibration. All of it. It's vibration that really changes us, and that's what Swamiji, with this path, most have to give.
Well, I think that sums it up very beautifully, the essence of everything that you've been saying. So thank you very much, Naya Swami Lakshman. I think a lot of people will gain a lot of inspiration for everything that you have shared with us. Thank you for being willing to do that.
Thanks very much for having hosted me.